My parents owned a white Mazda minivan. It was the most boring car we ever owned, I think. A white Mazda minivan. And one time, have you ever had something in your house where you had a smell, but you couldn't find where it was or what the cause of it was? It just got worse and worse for a long time. We had that problem in this minivan. We noticed one day this bad smell. We couldn't find it. Mom took everything out of the car, searched under all the seats and all the crevices, looked for everything, and the smell just got worse and worse, and it was really, really bad, and we couldn't find it. And finally, one day, she dug far enough under one of the seats, there was a little pocket under there, and she found it. And you know what the culprit was? It was a little can of orange juice concentrate that had rolled under the seat and been there for a week. And the only thing I could think when it was over was, what a mess. And it's one of those things where it didn't smell just for a little while. It wasn't after you cleaned it up, it was for a long time. So I would encourage you, when you get your groceries, don't let any cans of orange juice concentrate roll under your seats. But what a mess, right? And the truth is, and this, you look around at the world and you look at a lot of things and you think to yourselves, what a mess sometimes, right? Reading the newspaper is kind of like finding one of those cans of orange juice under the seat. It's a mess. And we look out there in our world and we say, my goodness, how are we ever going to clean this up? It smells, it's bad, it's just a mess. And it's not just in our country, right? I mean, we could look at the newspaper, we could look at the politics and everything that's happening now. We could look at all of the shootings and all the civil wars in Syria and the Middle East and all of the debates in Congress, and no one can figure out what to do. But we say, what a mess. But it's not just our country. We could look at stories of churches in the past who have gotten into debates over things that are so non-essential and gotten everything mixed up with drama, and you look at it and you say, what a mess. Some of us can look at, we're going to have family get-togethers in the next coming weeks for Christmas. And there are certain topics at the dinner table we know we have to avoid, because otherwise it's going to get heated. And we say, what a mess. And the truth is that everything around our lives, we see this. And as we get into this story today, we are in the part of the story of Israel where the nation splits apart. And it's really funny because last week we were in the time of Solomon, right? Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, the wealthiest king ever to reign in Israel, the one with all the power, all the peacetime, the one that everyone looked to as amazing. It was the golden age of Israel, and everything was together, and everyone was happy and well. It was the golden age of Israel in the time of Solomon. And then you fast forward 1 week in the story, 1 generation later, to the man who follows Solomon, and what happens? Except that the nation of Israel splits apart into two. And they fight each other for the coming decades and centuries. And you look at what happened in Israel, and you go from that golden age, and 1 generation later you're saying, what a mess in Israel. And it didn't take much for that to happen. And it rests on the lives of 2 people. And the truth is that these stories this week about how the nation split apart are probably not the ones that you've heard in Sunday school all your life. They're a little bit different stories. And yet I think they're important because we can see how both men messed up and split Israel apart and created a mess in God's nation. Which is a significant deal because God's nation and God's plan is for unity, for people to be together, to work together, to have their unified faith in the God of the universe. And yet it gets split apart, and you say to yourselves, what a mess. So the first man responsible is a man by the name of Rehoboam. Rehoboam is the son of Solomon. And so Solomon reigned in Israel. Things were well. Yes, Solomon got into sin later in life. He was worshiping other gods. And because of that, there's a prediction that the nation would be pulled out of his son's hands. And that's exactly what happens. Rehoboam comes to follow his father Solomon and be king in Israel. And so the elders and leaders in Israel, they come before Rehoboam and they say, okay, we need to confirm you as king. But before we do, we have one request of you. And so they ask nicely. They say this, Rehoboam, your father Solomon, during his reign, they built a temple. And so, because of that, because of everything he did, it was heavy taxation and hard manual labor all of our lives. Solomon worked us hard. He took a lot of our money. He worked us hard because we built the temple because of all of these things. And that was difficult and it was a heavy burden upon us. So our request to you, Rehoboam, is that now that that time has passed, we ask one thing of you. Lighten the yoke. Lighten the yoke. Make it a little easier. Lighten our burden. And if you do that, we will confirm you as king and follow you all of your life. This is all we ask for. Now Rehoboam, he's young and he's cocky. And he says to them, well, okay, give me a couple of days. Let me talk about it with my advisors. So Rehoboam, he goes back, and he finds the old elders and advisors of his father, the guys who have been around a while, the men who have experience and know what they're talking about. And they come to Rehoboam, and they say to Rehoboam, or Rehoboam asks them, what should I do? And they look at him and they say, Rehoboam, if today you will be a servant, if you will show kindness of heart, if you will be reasonable, if you will simply grant them this one request and be a kind leader, they will follow you all the days of their lives. And you will be a great king in Israel. Our advice to you is to listen to them and do the right thing. But Rehoboam is a young man. Rehoboam has other ideas and other thoughts. And so instead of immediately listening to them, he decides to get a little bit more advice. Maybe because he didn't like what he heard. And so Rehoboam does what many of us might do from time to time. Instead of going to the men who knew what they were talking about, instead he went to the guys he grew up with, his buddies. The guys that were, his friends, and they lived together and all this or that. All of them were young and inexperienced. And he goes to them and says to his buddy, now what should I do at this time? And they said, hold on. These people are asking for you to show weakness. They are trying to boss you around. You are the king of Israel. You need to stand up for yourself. You need to be confrontational. You need to start a battle with them. And so they give him this advice, and I'll actually read it here. Listen to the way they word this. This is what young, cocky men eager to get into a battle do. It's this. The young men who had grown up with him replied, these people have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. Now tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. Tough talk, right? When he says, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist, that's a symbol of power. That's his strength, his size, his power. The footprint he's going to leave upon the kingship. He says, he made your yoke heavy, I will make it heavier. He scourged you with whips, I'll scourge you with scorpions. You ever known that young cocky guy who didn't do the wise thing? The guy who was too eager to run into a battle. The guy who said the angry, confrontational words and ended up in a bad place. That's Rehoboam. So what do you think is going to happen? The leaders in Israel, they say, well, never mind. We have no business with you. We are leaving. And we're going to go our own way. And it turns out that because he is a descendant of David, the nation splits in two, right? And in the northern half, they continue to call that Israel. And in the southern half, they call that Judah, after the largest tribe. You can see the map. I actually put this up here today. I don't think I've used the map until today. But it's important. You've got to be able to visualize things. Okay, so the northern half is Israel, and the southern half is Judah. And sure enough, Rehoboam gets to maintain power in the south, in Judah, because he's of the tribe of David, which ruled over Judah. So he gets to keep power in the south. But instead, there's a new man who rises to power in the north. And that is a man by the name of Jeroboam. And Jeroboam, we find out, it was predicted by a prophet that he would become the next king. That Israel would be ripped out of the hands of Rehoboam, and that Jeroboam would get a large piece. I know, Rehoboam, Jeroboam, it's confusing. They have almost the same name. They're different people. Rehoboam gets the south. Jeroboam comes to power in the north. And apparently this is God's plan because it was predicted by a prophet as punishment for Solomon's sins. So Jeroboam rises to power in the north, Rehoboam in the south, and all of a sudden the nation is split apart. We're beginning to think, what a mess. But guess what? It gets worse. And not only is there the young, cocky guy who wanted to get into a battle and lost, but there's this other guy, Jeroboam, who has his own problems. And you may not know this story. Actually, they didn't really tell the story of Jeroboam in the story as I read it this week. Or not significantly. Not the part I want to talk about. So Jeroboam comes to power in the north. He is king over Israel. And he is God's chosen person for this task. But he's going to make a really big mistake. And it's a mistake that's going to be repeated throughout Scripture for the rest of the way, especially in the book of Kings. See, Jeroboam